He said, man, that sure is some good-looking stagecoach. That's what they call a bus, a motorhome.
Ernest Borgnine was a man who let nothing get under his skin, except for one co-star. He brawled with Spencer Tracy, clashed with Shelley Winters, and witnessed Joan Crawford's legendary wrath. But none of them compared to the one person he never forgave. Their feud wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal, humiliating, and unforgettable. It involved a disastrous marriage, brutal public mockery, and a final insult so ruthless that Borgnine carried the grudge for life. Who was it? And what did they do to make Hollywood's toughest man never let go? Let's discover. Section 1. Ernest Borgnine's legacy and reputation in Hollywood. Ernest Borgnine was a man of contradictions, a Hollywood tough guy with a face built for villains, but a heart that won over millions. His career spanned more than 6 decades, from his Academy Award-winning performance in Marty to his gritty, no-nonsense roles in The Wild Bunch and The Dirty Dozen. He wasn't afraid to throw himself into any role, whether it was a ruthless outlaw or a gentle soul looking for love. And just when younger audiences thought they'd never see him again, he reappeared, this time as Mermaid Man in SpongeBob SquarePants, bringing his larger-than-life personality to animation. But despite his reputation as one of Hollywood's most reliable and hard-working actors, not everyone had a good experience with him. Some co-stars clashed with his intensity. Some directors found his no-nonsense approach difficult to manage. And one actor, just one, earned his permanent hatred. Who was it? What happened? And why, despite the countless battles he fought on screen and off, was this the one betrayal he never let go of? Borgnine didn't fit the mold of a traditional Hollywood leading man. He wasn't impossibly handsome. He wasn't the charming rogue or the brooding anti-hero. But what he lacked in Hollywood polish, he made up for with raw presence. He could play a brute, a military commander, or the everyman struggling against the odds. And he did it all with an authenticity that made him unforgettable. His Oscar win for Marty was proof. He didn't need chiseled looks or smooth talk. He just needed one great role to show the world what he could do. He became a go-to actor for military films, drawing from his own experience in the Navy. His real-life service gave him a natural authority, and directors knew he could deliver. Whether it was as a merciless sergeant or a grizzled general, Borgnine brought a realism that made audiences believe in his characters. Even when he was playing a villain, there was something undeniably human about him, something that made it hard to look away. Off-screen, he was known for his work ethic. He showed up on time, every time, and put in the effort, no matter the project. Big-budget war films, low-budget TV pilots, even cheesy late-career action flicks, he never phoned it in. To directors and producers, he was a professional. To younger actors, he was a mentor. And to his fans, he was a legend. But that doesn't mean he was easy to work with. Borgnine had his share of on-set battles. He didn't believe in tiptoeing around egos or dealing with diva behavior. If he had a problem with a co-star, they knew it. One of his most famous clashes was with Spencer Tracy on the set of Bad Day at Black Rock. Tracy was already a legend, but Borgnine was still trying to prove himself. The tension between them built throughout filming, and when it came time for their big fight scene, it got a little too real. Borgnine accidentally punched Tracy for real, leaving the veteran actor momentarily stunned. Then there was Shelley Winters, his co-star in The Poseidon Adventure. Winters was passionate, demanding, and known for pushing directors and screenwriters to reshape her roles. She insisted on rewriting lines, reworking entire character arcs, and even fighting for changes on the spot. Her dedication earned her awards, but it frustrated Borgnine to no end. One particularly grueling underwater scene had to be filmed 65 times, stretching what should have been a few hours into a 14-hour nightmare. Borgnine later admitted it was one of the hardest days of his career. And then there was Joan Crawford. Crawford was a Hollywood powerhouse, but she had a notorious temper. During the filming of Johnny Guitar, Borgnine witnessed her tear apart a co-star's wardrobe, throw hot coffee at an assistant, and nearly come to blows with Mercedes McCambridge. Borgnine never forgot what he saw, later describing Crawford as a ticking time bomb. But none of these actors were the one that he never forgave. Those were professional clashes, temporary frustrations, on-set feuds that faded over time. But this was personal. Section 2, the shocking revelation. Who did Borgnine hate the most? This is the one thing Ernest Borgnine never wanted you to know. For decades, Hollywood insiders whispered about his behind-the-scenes feuds, but one name was always left out, until now. It wasn't Spencer Tracy. It wasn't Joan Crawford. It wasn't even Shelley Winters. The truth is far more personal, far more humiliating, and far more shocking than any petty on-set rivalry. This wasn't just a fight between co-stars. It was a betrayal so deep that Borgnine carried it with him for the rest of his life. And now, new details have come to light, revealing the real reason he never forgave Ethel Merman. In Hollywood, failed marriages come and go. Celebrities marry on impulse, divorce in private, and move on to the next affair without a second thought. But Borgnine and Merman's union was different, not because it ended quickly, but because it ended in a way so brutal, so humiliating, that Borgnine never fully recovered. Their marriage, which lasted a mere 32 days, wasn't just a mistake, it was a disaster. From the outside, it seemed like a dream pairing, a beloved Hollywood tough guy and a Broadway legend. Two icons from different worlds, coming together in what should have been a glamorous powerhouse marriage. But instead, it became one of the most infamous and embarrassing unions in entertainment history. And it all started with a honeymoon from hell. Borgnine and Merman married on June 27, 1964, with all the glitz and spectacle of a classic Hollywood wedding. But before they even left for their honeymoon in Japan, the cracks had already started to show. Borgnine, fresh off a string of successful films, was adored by international fans, something Merman wasn't prepared for. As they arrived in Tokyo, the crowds weren't screaming for her, they were screaming for him. Everywhere they went, Borgnine was mobbed by adoring fans, autograph seekers, and reporters, while Merman was barely noticed. For a woman who had spent her entire life in the spotlight, it was a public humiliation like no other. She seethed as Borgnine lapped up the attention, smiling for cameras, shaking hands, and basking in the adoration of the people. She had expected a honeymoon filled with romance and the kind of attention she was used to receiving on Broadway. Instead, she was stuck playing second fiddle to a man she had never considered her equal in the entertainment world. The resentment boiled over almost immediately. Witnesses later recalled fights breaking out daily, explosive arguments behind closed doors, icy silences in public. The marriage, which had started as a passionate whirlwind, collapsed within days. By the time they returned to the United States, Merman was already plotting her escape. And when she left, she didn't just walk away. She made sure Borgnine never forgot it. For most people, a failed month-long marriage would be an embarrassing footnote, something to move on from quietly. But Ethel Merman made sure that her hatred for Borgnine was permanent, public, and unmistakable. In 1978, she released her autobiography, Merman, detailing her storied career and personal life. Readers turned the pages, eager to hear about her experiences in Broadway, film, and music. Then they reached the chapter titled My Marriage to Ernest Borgnine, and found a blank page, not a single word. It was the ultimate insult, a cold, calculated way of erasing Borgnine from her history. No bitter words, no scandalous details, no attempt to justify the disaster of their marriage. Just silence, a humiliating void where he should have been. It was a move so petty and devastating that it still stings today. Borgnine, for all his tough guy roles, was crushed. Years later, when asked about the blank page stunt, he admitted that it haunted him. That blank page said more to me than anything she could have written, he said in an interview. It was a slap in the face. I'll never forget it. Unlike Merman, Borgnine never erased her from his story. He spoke about the marriage honestly, admitting it was a mistake, admitting they clashed but never pretending it didn't happen. And yet, he couldn't hide the fact that her final act of cruelty got under his skin. Over the years, people tried to get Merman to talk about it. She refused. She dismissed questions, shut down interviews, and acted as if the marriage had never even occurred. It was as if she had found the perfect way to get the last word, by never speaking about it again. But here's the real kicker. Borgnine had 5 marriages. He loved being in love, and while some of his other relationships were rocky, none of them left scars like this one. Even his messy, publicized divorces with other women didn't haunt him the way this did. And it's easy to see why. A public feud is one thing, a bitter divorce is another. But being erased entirely, that's something else. It wasn't just an attack on him, it was an attack on his very existence in her life. Despite being a tough, no-nonsense man, Borgnine was deeply sentimental. He cared what people thought of him, and he valued his reputation. He didn't mind people remembering his fights, his struggles, even his worst moments on set. But being dismissed so completely, that was unforgivable. The Hollywood press had a field day with it. The joke became that Borgnine's shortest role was being Ethel Merman's husband. Late-night hosts mocked him, and the blank page stunt became legendary in entertainment circles. Merman, for all her talent, was notorious for holding grudges. But this was something different. This was a career woman who had spent her life controlling her own narrative, and she made sure Borgnine had no place in it. Even in his final years, when reflecting on his long, successful career, Borgnine never forgave her. He refused to say anything cruel, refused to speak badly of her in interviews, but that silence said everything. In one of his last interviews, he was asked about his biggest regrets in life. He thought about it for a moment and then shook his head. "There's just some things I'll never understand." And when pressed, he said nothing more. Section 3. How the Borgnine-Merman feud started. What happens when two of Hollywood's most unstoppable personalities collide? For Ernest Borgnine and Ethel Merman, it wasn't a match made in heaven. It was a collision course toward one of the fastest and most humiliating breakups in entertainment history. Their marriage lasted just over a month, but the damage lasted a lifetime. It was a relationship doomed from the start, filled with rivalry, resentment, and public embarrassment. But how did two of the biggest stars of their time fall into something so disastrous? And why did it all unravel so quickly? To understand what went wrong, you have to go back to 1955. That was the year Borgnine became a Hollywood superstar overnight. He had been grinding away in supporting roles for years, mostly playing thugs, villains, and military tough guys. But when Marty hit the big screen, everything changed. Marty was nothing like the films that made him famous. There were no gunfights, no barroom brawls, no hardened soldiers or outlaw gangs. Instead, Borgnine played a lonely butcher looking for love. It was quiet, emotional, and completely unexpected. And it won him an Academy Award. In a matter of months, he went from being a reliable character actor to a household name, rubbing elbows with Hollywood's elite. Meanwhile, Ethel Merman didn't need a breakout role. She was already royalty. By the time she met Borgnine, Merman was Broadway's queen. She had spent decades dominating the stage, belting out show-stopping numbers in musicals like Annie Get Your Gun, Call Me Madam, and Gypsy. Her voice was unmistakable, bold, powerful, and loud, just like her personality. She was a woman who commanded attention wherever she went, and for most of her career, she had been the biggest star in any room she walked into. That's where the trouble started. When Borgnine and Merman crossed paths in the early 1960s, the entertainment world saw it as a perfect match. The tough guy of Hollywood and the grande dame of Broadway, two larger-than-life personalities, coming together in what should have been a power couple for the ages. But what people didn't realize was that these weren't two performers on equal footing. Merman, despite her success, was a Broadway star first, a Hollywood name second. Her biggest triumphs were on the stage, and while she had appeared in films, she was never truly part of the Hollywood system the way Borgnine was. He, on the other hand, was thriving in movies and television, appearing in war epics, action films, and prestige dramas. Merman was used to being the biggest star in the room, but when she was with Borgnine, she wasn't. Despite their differences, their romance moved at lightning speed. By early 1964, they were seen at every major industry event together. Gossip columns couldn't get enough of them. Borgnine was the tough, no-nonsense leading man, and Merman was the larger-than-life diva with a razor-sharp wit. The press loved them, but the people closest to them, they weren't so sure. Friends of both Borgnine and Merman later admitted that the relationship never made sense. They had nothing in common. Their temperaments were completely different. They both had huge personalities and weren't known for backing down in an argument. But to the public, the romance was a sensation. Then, on June 27, 1964, they made it official. Their wedding was a spectacle. The press swarmed the ceremony, and entertainment journalists covered it like it was the royal wedding of the decade. For Merman, this was her fourth marriage. For Borgnine, it was his third. They should have known better. And they did. Because by the time the wedding photos were printed in newspapers, the marriage was already falling apart. It started with the honeymoon. Japan should have been a romantic getaway, a chance for the newlyweds to enjoy their time together, away from the Hollywood spotlight. But instead, it became a disaster. The moment they landed, Borgnine was mobbed by fans. Everywhere they went, people screamed his name, reached out for autographs, begged for photos. And Merman? She was ignored. It was a public humiliation. She had spent her life as the star, the one people adored, the one people fought to see. But here she was, watching as her new husband was treated like a king, while she was treated like an afterthought. Borgnine, oblivious or indifferent to his wife's growing resentment, soaked up the attention. He posed for pictures, smiled for reporters, shook hands with fans, and embraced the adoration. Merman, meanwhile, grew angrier by the day. Witnesses later recalled whispered fights in the hotel, moments where Merman snapped at Borgnine, her voice filled with frustration. The tension got worse and worse until, by the time they boarded the plane back to the United States, they could barely speak to each other. By the time they landed, Merman had already made up her mind. It wasn't just that she was unhappy. It wasn't just that the marriage wasn't working. It was the embarrassment. The fact that everyone had watched this happen. The fact that the press, the fans, and the entire industry had seen her get overshadowed by a man she never thought would outshine her. She didn't wait long. Within weeks, she had filed for divorce. There was no attempt at reconciliation, no long, drawn-out legal battle. Just a swift, brutal exit, one that left Borgnine completely blindsided. Friends later said that Borgnine had been shocked. He knew the honeymoon had been a disaster, but he hadn't expected Merman to leave so quickly. But for her, it wasn't just about leaving him, it was about erasing him. And what she did next, that's what made sure he would never forgive her. Section 4. The feud's aftermath. Did they ever reconcile? How do you come back from a public humiliation that the whole world is laughing at? Ernest Borgnine had survived war, Hollywood brawls, and playing some of the most hated villains in cinema, but nothing had prepared him for what came after his 32-day marriage to Ethel Merman. It wasn't just a personal disaster, it became a joke that followed him for the rest of his life. The blank page in Merman's autobiography was a final insult, but the real damage came from how the world reacted. Late-night talk shows had a field day. It was too easy. A marriage that lasted barely a month, a Hollywood tough guy getting publicly erased by his Broadway star wife. Every comedian in town had a punchline ready. The longest fight scene of Borgnine's career only lasted 4 weeks. One TV host joked that Borgnine's shortest role wasn't in a movie, it was as Merman's husband. He could handle playing villains. He could handle getting booed in public after From Here to Eternity because his character had beaten Frank Sinatra to death on screen. But this was real life, and it was embarrassing. The worst part? The jokes never stopped. For the rest of his career, whenever an interviewer wanted to catch him off guard, they would bring it up. It didn't matter how many great films he made. It didn't matter that he won an Oscar. It didn't matter that he became a beloved TV star. The Ethel Merman disaster was always lurking in the background. And what about Merman? Did she regret it? Did she ever say anything to defend herself? Not a word, not a single public statement. She never addressed the blank page, never explained why she did it, and never spoke about Borgnine again. It was as if he had never existed. That silence was the most powerful thing she could have done. If she had given interviews, if she had criticized him, if she had written a scathing chapter about their marriage, it might have faded into Hollywood history like any other messy celebrity breakup. But instead, she left it as a void. And that void haunted Borgnine for years. Because unlike Merman, he talked about it. Maybe he wanted to defend himself. Maybe he wanted people to understand what really happened. But whatever the reason, whenever someone asked, he answered. And his answer was always the same. He never deserved that kind of treatment. He didn't pretend the marriage was good. He admitted they fought, admitted it was a mistake. But the blank page, the way she acted like it had never happened, that was what he couldn't let go of. He never remarried a celebrity again. After Merman, he married a woman outside the industry, someone who had nothing to do with Hollywood or Broadway. He had already been through 5 marriages in his life, but Merman was the only one he refused to forgive. Maybe it was because it was so public, or maybe it was because she had all the power in the breakup. He was the one left embarrassed. He was the one turned into a joke. Their marriage was one of the shortest in Hollywood history, but their feud lasted a lifetime. And yet, their legacies couldn't be more different. Merman is still remembered as the greatest voice Broadway ever produced. People celebrate her musicals, her performances, her stage presence. Her marriages? Barely a footnote. Borgnine, on the other hand, is remembered as one of Hollywood's toughest, most versatile actors. He made audiences love him, hate him, and fear him. He was an Oscar-winning star of war films, westerns, and even kids' cartoons. But for all the incredible work he did, his marriage to Merman still looms in the background. It wasn't just a breakup. It wasn't just another failed Hollywood romance. It was a humiliation so profound that it became part of his story forever. And even in his final years, even when he had moved on, he never forgave her. Section 5. Borgnine's other infamous feuds. He wasn't always the victim. What happens when a man known for playing brutes, villains, and tough guys refuses to back down in real life? Ernest Borgnine had built a career on being the most intimidating man in the room. But that reputation didn't always work in his favor. While his feud with Ethel Merman was deeply personal, it wasn't the only battle he fought in Hollywood. Over the years, Borgnine found himself at odds with some of the most powerful figures in the industry. And in some cases, he wasn't just the victim, he was part of the problem. Borgnine never claimed to be an easygoing co-star. He was blunt, he spoke his mind, and he didn't believe in Hollywood's delicate social rules. He wasn't interested in flattering directors or massaging the egos of leading actors. If someone on set rubbed him the wrong way, they were going to know about it, and that made for some unforgettable on-set feuds. One of the strangest and most chaotic battles Borgnine ever witnessed didn't even involve him directly, but he was stuck in the middle of it. The set of Johnny Guitar was a war zone, and the real fight had nothing to do with the movie's script. The film's 2 leading women, Joan Crawford and Mercedes McCambridge, hated each other. The tension between them wasn't just professional, it was personal. Crawford was Hollywood royalty, a major movie star for decades, and she wasn't about to share the spotlight with McCambridge, a respected character actress. McCambridge, on the other hand, wasn't intimidated by Crawford's reputation. She was tough, sharp-tongued, and didn't back down from anyone. The result? A set that became legendary for its behind-the-scenes battles. Borgnine later recalled how Crawford would go out of her way to make McCambridge's life miserable. At one point, she took McCambridge's costumes and threw them into the middle of a highway, forcing the crew to run out and retrieve them before they were ruined. Another time, she dumped an entire thermos of hot coffee onto a production assistant in a fit of rage. The 2 women had to film their scenes separately because they refused to be in the same room together. And Borgnine? He was just trying to do his job while chaos erupted around him. He later called it the most unprofessional thing I ever saw. And that was coming from a man who had been in some of Hollywood's biggest on-set disasters. But while he was just a bystander in the Johnny Guitar feud, he wasn't so passive when it came to his battle with Shelley Winters. Winters was a force to be reckoned with. She wasn't just an actress, she was a perfectionist, a scene stealer, and someone who believed in doing things her way. When she and Borgnine were cast together in the Poseidon adventure, it was a recipe for pure exhaustion. Winters was notorious for rewriting her own dialogue, pushing for script changes, and fighting with directors over her character's decisions. She didn't just want to perform the role, she wanted to control the entire film. And Borgnine, who had spent his career following scripts and trusting directors, had no patience for it. Their biggest battle came during the filming of one of the movie's most grueling scenes, an underwater escape sequence that required the actors to hold their breath, swim through a submerged hallway, and make it to the other side before running out of air. It was supposed to be a quick shoot, but instead, it turned into a nightmare that lasted over 14 hours. Winters kept insisting on multiple takes, pushing herself and the crew to absolute exhaustion. Borgnine, who had already done his part of the scene multiple times, was furious. By the time they were done filming, Borgnine was barely speaking to her. Years later, he admitted that he had never been more frustrated on a set than he was working with Winters. But despite all the tension, he still respected her as an actress. Even though she exhausted him, he never held on to resentment the way he did with Merman. And then there was Spencer Tracy. Unlike Winters, who clashed with Borgnine over her creative control, Tracy didn't even need to argue. He let his presence do the work. When they starred together in Bad Day at Black Rock, Borgnine was still a rising star, while Tracy was a Hollywood legend. Tracy had a reputation for being intimidating, and he had a habit of keeping younger actors on edge. He didn't shout, he didn't fight, he just changed lines on the spot, adjusted his performance mid-scene, and forced his co-stars to adapt in real time. It was a kind of psychological warfare, and Borgnine struggled to keep up. Then came their big fight scene. It was supposed to be a carefully choreographed brawl. Borgnine's character, a brutish thug, going head-to-head with Tracy's one-armed war veteran. But something about the way Tracy carried himself made Borgnine overthink every move. He kept messing up his lines, ruining takes, and making mistakes. And then, in one moment of frustration, Borgnine accidentally punched Tracy for real. The set went silent. Tracy, known for his quiet but imposing presence, simply took a step back, straightened his jacket, and kept going as if nothing had happened. But Borgnine later admitted that in that moment, he had never felt smaller. The two men never became close, but Tracy ultimately respected Borgnine's talent. Not long after the film, Tracy recommended him for Marty, the role that would win him an Oscar. The feud between them was intense, but in the end, it wasn't personal. It was just professional pressure. Which brings us back to Ethel Merman. Unlike Tracy, who challenged him to be better, or Winters, who frustrated him on set but eventually earned his admiration, Merman's feud with Borgnine was different. It wasn't about filmmaking. It wasn't about professional disagreements. It wasn't about two actors struggling for control of a scene. It was deeply, painfully personal. And that's why, of all his Hollywood feuds, this was the one he never let go of. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Click the next video for more exciting content.